Hey everybody, it's Rev from Into Gaming. Today we're going to work on a blueprint interface based line trace system for interaction. It's going to be a multiplayer setup. We're doing this in a Unreal Engine 5.2 project, and I'm using the first person template to have some kind of a base here. So getting into this, I'm going to just sling functionality. We're going to write code really fast. I'm not going to explain it. I will come back at the end of the video and walk through the steps and tell you why I've done it the way that I've done it, so it makes sense. Other than that, let's just dive right into it. The default setup has event begin play, get controller. You're going to cast to the default controller class, and then off this you're going to run it to the enhanced. For this setup, we're actually going to promote that to a variable because you're going to need this variable. Other than that, I would suggest adding a delay. This is a shortcut hack kind of thing, just to get things rolling. Otherwise, you're going to have to write some polling and so forth because of how multiplayer works in dedicated servers in the wild. So like a production run, you won't have this type of setup. Anyway, so get that taken care of, and we want to have an interact key. So the default does not have an interact key, so you're going to have to go into the advanced input and set up an interact key, or you can just use a regular keyboard event like enter or F or E or whatever you want to set up for your configuration. With that, let's go ahead and just dive straight into this and get things rolling. First thing we're going to need to do is, under content, create a folder called blueprints. So I like to store blueprint functionality in a blueprints folder. Inside blueprints, we want to create a folder called interfaces. Inside interfaces, we're going to create a blueprint interface. BPI, interact. Naming convention BPI allows us to find our BPIs real quick. So with that, we're going to open it up, and the very first function, we want to name that interact, compile, and save that. In future videos, this is part 1 of a series, so once we get into the videos 2 and 3 and so forth, we're going to be working with doors, setting up multiplayer doors, and we will be adding more functions to that blueprint interface for extended features and functionality. So with that, we have our interface set up. So the next thing we need to do is go into our input and set up a switch has authority, and we're going to need a custom event, and this is going to be serve interact. This server interaction event is going to be running on server and reliable. And from there, we're going to need a new function. This one, BPI trace, and compile. And we'll get back into that in just a second. Now we're going to take our trace and run it off the remote pin, off remote, and then take and set that up as well. Set the event up as well. We'll get back to this in a little bit once we're all set up with our function. So inside our function, we set up a sequence. I'm going to zoom out a little bit. Off the then 0, we're going to reroute, and let's make a couple of local variables. We're going to need world location, it's a vector, and then we're going to need forward vector, which obviously is a vector. So we're going to take our forward vector, we're going to bring it up here, and we're going to set that. So get base aim rotation, get forward vector off here, switch has authority. And we're going to go up here and add a reroute node, and then we're going to pop world location there, and we're going to pop world location here. For the remote side of things, we're going to come up here and grab our camera. Doesn't matter if your camera's named different. I renamed the camera and the mesh on this. So we need to get world location here. Tighten that up. Alright, that's set. And this is where our player controller reference comes in. So player controller reference, we can get that. Get player camera manager. And then we're going to get camera location. And I'll explain the usage for these once everything is good to go and we've tested. Alright, that's nice and clean. Alright, then we're going to do our line trace. Line trace by channel. You could do a sphere trace, you can do a box trace, but it's always going to be a single trace. We don't want multiples. We're going to do world location and get the forward vector right into the start pin, and then we're going to pop this and do an add. And we're going to do forward vector. We're going to do a multiply, and then we're going to change the bottom pin. Right click and to float single precision. Off that, we want to promote this to a local. We're going to call it trace length. This is how far out we're going to do our trace. And we're going to go ahead and default that to 200 centimeters. That's 2 meters. That's a good distance. Bring these up. Get this all nice and clean. So everything looks good. I'm going to straighten that one real quick. I'm a stickler for keeping things organized and clean. Makes for easy reading, and I think that's good enough. We're going to do make array. Pull that up, and then we're going to do self. And we're going to expand this out. We're going to do a draw duration of not one frame. We want to do it for the draw debug type for duration. Off the trace color, we're going to promote that to a local, and that will be trace color. And the default trace color is red. And we want to go back over here. We want to drag the trace color up to the top one, and we're going to set that color to something different. I like purple. And right here, off the return value, we will do a branch. Just bear with me, guys. We're almost done with this. And we're going to break the hit result. Off of this, we want to return and pipe this over here, expand it out. We need a branch. And this is where our blueprint interface comes in. Off of hit actor, we're going to come up, does, just type does, and you'll see it does implement interface. And we want to pipe that in here. Off the false on that branch, we want to do another return. And we want to set our BPI interact. And then we're going to take hit actor again. And we're going to do a reroute. Boom. And then off this, we'll do a switch as authority. Hopefully you guys see what's going on here, but if you don't, I'll definitely explain that in just a few minutes. Alright, let's just do it like this. We want to type interact, and we're going to BPI interact. We want the interact message, and we're going to pipe that to authority. Get this all nice and cleaned up. Now for remote, we want SRV for our server interact. And then from there, we're just doing returns. Just semantics. I always like putting my returns in. Alright. All of that looks good. We'll come back to this. I'm actually going to zoom in on this so you can see what's going on. You can pause that out to make sure that you have everything set up correctly. Alright, moving forward, we're going to come back out into our blueprints folder, and we're going to create a new blueprint class. And it's going to be of actor type BP interact test. We need an actor that we can test on, so we're going to open that up. And right out of the gate, we're going to do a scene component, emit root. The default scene component, it's the same as another scene component, just the default has a sprite so that you can see that it's there. We don't need that. I don't like having that extra little sprite thing in there. So anyway, moving on, static mesh. Add a static mesh. Under that, click on the static mesh. We want to add a box collision. We're going to name that interact collision. The static mesh. Back to the static mesh. We're going to go cube, and I'm going to use this cube. That's the default one from the map. I'm going to go through and turn off the overlap events. We don't need that. Everything here it needs to be custom. We need to do query only. Actually, we could do probably a block all. No, let's just do a custom. We don't need physics queries on there. So we're going to change this to world dynamic, and we're just going to block everything on that. So that looks good. Let's go to left perspective. And because we're using a scene component as root, the root's origin is always 0, 0, 0. Notice we don't get anything on the transform there. So static mesh, we need to bring the bottom of the static mesh up to basically the floor, which is the x-axis. So we're good. Compile that, and then we're off to the interact collision. And we want to go ahead and hit the shape and the extent, and we want to go 55, 55, 55. And that will give us a nice little cushion of collision around. We can go back to perspective, and you can see that it's wrapping. Ooh, it's pretty fast. It's pretty fast. Okay, we're pretty solid there. So the interact collision itself, go ahead and close that. Collision itself, we need to turn off overlaps, no for character can stand up on, and then go custom, query only, world dynamic, ignore all, and then come back and make sure that the only thing that it's blocking is visibility. That's the only interaction we want, is a line trace visibility to hit it. And that is it, other than going into the class settings, and we need to add that interface. We need to implement it. So now it's implemented. Now we can go back into our level, drag our actor in, and let's float them up a little bit, and save and play. See what's going on here. Alright, we're getting hits. Alright, so just so we know what's going on here, get rid of all these. We're going to right click on the interface, implement event. And what I like to do is switch as authority on all these, because really we only want the server to do this. So as the authority, we're going to print a string, and we're going to say interacted. we're going to give this a different color other than blue. Don't need it to print the log. Compile, play. Alright, we can go up to our cube, and we get our little message, server interacted, server interacted, server interacted, server interacted. Alright, so we got complete interaction. We're good to go. So I can jump back through here and explain what's going on with the code. So when a player inputs a key action, we're going to use switch as authority so that only the client can execute that input. So generally with inputs, they can be mirrored over onto the server. So if without the switch as authority, what you could have happening is when you press enter, the packet system will bundle in that you pressed input, so the server will run input as well. So we don't want that to happen, so we're getting multiple traces out. So we're saying only for the client we want to run the initial trace. Once we get into the trace, we're coming up and we're setting the forward vector. Generally, that you're going to be using a forward vector handles off your pitch and yaw. So we're going to use get base aim rotation for both, so they'll both be the same. Generally, the server, I mean, we could use the camera, take the camera and set its get its forward vector that way through rotation, but for the server we can't do that. We have to use get base aim rotation or get control rotation. You can go off control rotation and then forward vector, but this is not as accurate. This approach is not as accurate as using get base aim rotation. From there, we have that client or server set up again, switch as authority. So as the authority, the server, we want to get the player's camera manager and get the location from the camera manager. Whatever camera is active, that's the location it's going to get. So if you have two cameras, a third person and a first person that you can toggle back and forth, whatever one is currently active is the one that's going to be returned for the camera location. Again, with cameras themselves, the component, the actual location of that camera is not updated onto the component on the server. As best I can tell, through every test that I've run, it's never the same. So we can't just get a reference to the camera, get world location. It will not match. It actually sits at the same location as default. So if you have a third-person character, for example, and when they crouch, the camera moves, would say, like in a true first-person setup, the camera is attached to the head socket. So when the character crouches, that camera component is going to move wherever the head is. And on the server, it's still at the base default location standing up. So when they run traces, they're not going to hit. They're actually pretty close to a meter apart. So with the local on the client, we can use world location, but on the server, we need to use the player camera manager, and you have to get that off of a casted player controller reference. You could go through the whole process of get controller and then do a cast to, what do we name this? PC underscore first person to the controller, and you can go through here and where is it at? Convert to pure cast, and then get player camera manager. You can do it that way, but you're casting every time. So you got to think about that spam of hitting your interact key. You don't want to be casting every time that happens. So it's better to just create a reference and use the reference. So it's one cast and it's done, and you never have to go back to it. As long as you're using that casted variable a lot, then just setting a variable for it is fine. So we have the forward vector that's going to be used by both. Let's note that, used by both. And then we have the server's reference for where the camera is. And we always can use for the client literal FP, your camera reference, drag it in, get world location, we're solid. And we're good there. So our line trace goes in, it's just a default line trace, no big deal. If we don't get a return on this, so no hits, we just jump out of the function. Otherwise, we run through. We're going to check and see if that actor implements the interface. If it doesn't, we're going to cancel out. And this is where it gets fun. If the client is firing this trace, if it is the client that's running this trace, which is going to be the remote, we're going to call the server interact here. So everything else is passed. So we get a valid hit that we are working with an interface asset that has BPI interact implemented. We're going to call the server to run the trace. So we're not going to spam the server every time we hit that key to interact. We only want to call the server, send an RPC to the server if we get a valid interaction. Otherwise, it's the server running the trace, and it's the authority. If it gets a valid return, it does the interaction. So compacted this all in. In future videos, there will be an update to the criteria here, this being the criteria section, because what we're doing right here isn't technically accurate as far as the interaction goes. So I'll tell you why real quick. If we jump back to our interact, the actor itself implements the interface, and because the static mesh is blocking visibility, I technically don't need that collision to get a true back out. So let's, for example, let's rescale this, take that shape, and we're going to take it down to 15, 15, and 15. So that's pretty small. Pull it out right here. Get up above it a little bit, and I'm going to pull it off to that corner. Yeah, that looks good. So now we're on a corner. Our interaction trace is on the corner. And just so we can see it, let's go to rendering, hidden in game, and play. Where's it at? See, there's our trace. That's what we want to enable the interaction. We have to hit that. That's the end game, is we want the player to have to hit that. So say that's an elevator keypad, or if that's a collision on a door for interaction, we want them to have to actually hit that interaction point in order for the trace to validate. But you can see here it's not validating. I mean, it's actually validating just by hitting the actor. So what we need to do in step 2 of this, which is another video, is modify out that interaction so that we can get the actual proper setup going with this. So there's going to be a little bit more here in part 2, and part 2 will handle this along with creating our first door. So with that, we're going to jump right back out of this, and I think this will do it. Have any questions, go ahead and hit the comments. Have a good one.